don't hear much about the racial wealth gap, but you should.
With something called the racial wealth gap.
About this wealth gap, let's talk specifically
to truly understand the racial wealth gap.
The racial wealth gap in the United States.
A widening racial wealth gap.
Kalencia Talk presents the reality behind the large racial wealth gap between white and African American households. Make sure you stay tuned and pay attention for more information throughout the documentary. Thank you. Wealth, the measure of an individual's or family's financial net worth, provides all sorts of opportunities for American families. African American families have a fraction of wealth of white families, leaving them more economically insecure and with far fewer opportunities for economic mobility.
Whites, living in just about 82 million homes, while there are 40 million blacks, living in just over 14 million homes. To truly understand the racial wealth gap, you must look past the income of these families and evaluate household worth. According to demos.org, in total, white American households own 90% of the national wealth. In contrast, black Americans altogether own less than 2.6% of the national wealth, with most of this small sliver being in the hands of black baby boomer retirees. Black working age families are largely invisible nationally in terms of wealth. To give a clearer lens, the bottom 50% of American households control only 1% of the national wealth. And of the total 14 million black households, likely over 10 million black families fall into this bottom group that owns nearly no wealth. The racial wealth gap is real and it's growing.
Unfortunately, wealth in this country is unequally distributed by race and particularly between white and black households. According to Federal Reserve, nearly 1 in 5 black households has zero or negative net worth. The share of white households without any wealth is considerably small at 9%.
This is the economy in black and white. Everything you own, houses, stocks, cars, that's your wealth. In 2011, the wealth of the median white household was over $110,000. African Americans on average, 17 times less, just over $6,000. And housing has a lot to do with it. For the average American, their home is the most valuable part of their portfolio. It's an investment that can appreciate with time, and it can be passed from one generation to the next. But the rate of homeownership among whites is 28% higher than that of blacks, and the lingering effects of segregation could be to blame. Discriminatory practices by the Federal Housing Authority prevented African Americans from buying houses in many suburban neighborhoods. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 sought to level the playing field. But by then, African Americans were entering a housing market that had already seen massive appreciation. Meanwhile, white families had seen their housing investment soar in value during their head start. Fast forward to the 21st century, minority groups were again victims of housing exploitation, this time by big banks. Bank of America and Wells Fargo, among others, were compelled to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and restitution for pushing minorities into exploitative subprime mortgages and charging them higher rates and fees. This contributed to the fact that blacks and Hispanics lost nearly a quarter of their wealth between 2004 and 2010. Whites lost just 1% during that same period. So the American economy houses two realities, one black, one white. The divide between them, a measure of inequality.
Percent, as you well know, is overwhelmingly white. We're talking about the top tier of Americans who have and own a majority of the nation's wealth. These are people who are uber rich. There are a few African Americans who have made it to that tier, but compared to the number of whites in the 1%, they are literally a percent of the 1%.
So why is the 1% so white? It has to do with something called the racial wealth gap.
For every dollar of wealth held by the typical white household, the typical African American household owns only 6 cents of wealth.
6 cents. You heard right. So how did we get here?
When you think about wealth, you have to understand that it's generational, that wealth left over generations actually compounds and builds and grows. African Americans were held as slaves and they weren't allowed to earn any income. They weren't allowed to own things at one point in time.
Thomas Dunn.
All right, and what do you do here at South Atlanta?
I'm the law teacher and the work-based learning teacher.
All right, so I will be asking you a few questions for my documentary today. The first question is, how do you feel about the racial wealth gap between white and African American households?
I believe the racial wealth gap is real. I believe it's historic in nature, and it's the result of hundreds of years of discrimination, multi-generational poverty, and racism.
All right. There are two types of inequality that affect African Americans and the large racial wealth gap. There is income inequality and there is wealth inequality. The top 1% is white people.
It's evident that all men and women are created equal. Just kidding. Sorry, no. We're not all equal. Inequality, in fact, gets a ton of attention these days. President Obama called it, quote, the defining challenge of our time. But usually when people are talking about inequality, they're talking about income inequality. And income inequality is at its highest level since the Great Depression. Before taxes, the top 1% take home about 22.5% of the national income. Really think about that for a second. For every dollar paid in income in the US, almost a quarter of it goes to the top 1%. A quarter! But income inequality is actually less dangerous than its cousin, wealth inequality. The top 1% hold closer to 40% of the national wealth. So for every dollar in American assets, that's home, stock, savings, all that, 40 cents of it belongs to the top 1%. The top 1% holds more wealth in America.
Families of color are especially disadvantaged because they're less likely to have savings or inherit wealth and face significant barriers to building wealth, such as discriminatory policies and practices that thwart home ownership. These structural disadvantages have built up to the point where the median net worth of white families is now more than 10 times greater than that of African American.
Though the United States is one of the wealthiest countries, to many Americans, this prosperity remains out of reach. Blacks and Hispanics who are striving to make a better life for themselves and their families are not given the same asset-building opportunities.
According to Institution for Policy Studies and Prosperity Now, if the racial wealth divide is left unaddressed, median black household wealth is on a path to hit zero by 2053. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Can you tell us your name?
I am Richard Fox.
And what do you do here?
I am a math teacher. I'm a geometry teacher.
All right. So I'm going to ask you a few questions for this interview for my document. In conclusion, I asked what we get wrong about closing the racial wealth gap.
These things were done on purpose and find ways that we can not ignore that but move forward. And one of the things that I learned in college was that in the African American Studies class that I was in, they taught that one of the biggest things that we do wrong when it comes to race is trying to think about a colorblind society. Let's just ignore race and move forward. Well, no, because there are things that are specific problems that have to do with this group and this group. And if we're ignoring race, then we're not focusing on the things that are specific to this group. And so we're glassing over the problems and never going to address them. And so these are things that I think we get wrong, is by not having the tough conversations and making sure that these things.
Thank you for watching.